Hey, so we are going to go over Alsace now, which is one of my personal favorite wine regions ever, both just from the wines, the culture, the place itself. It is beautiful. It's one of my favorite places I've ever visited. And just like the rest of the videos, we are going to go through the study guide on the side, so I highly recommend you go ahead, pull that up right now, pause the video if you need to, so that we can go through everything side by side and then add on any notes that you need. So first of all, where is Alsace? This is in eastern France, right along the border with Germany, and there is quite an interesting history here that it goes back and forth of rule of Germany and France. Roman Empire was in there for a while, and it has been a part of France officially, again, since 1945. And as far as laws go with it, Alsace received its official appellation status in 1962, which makes it one of the legally youngest official wine regions, large wine regions in all of France, even though they've been making wine there for a very, very long time. And just to go through some basics, we went along with the location. Climate is continental. It is a little bit on the drier side, and that is partly due to this rain shadow that it experiences. And if you remember from the viticulture and vinification video, we went over that. A rain shadow essentially occurs when there is this moisture in the air, and as it rises up and up in elevation, it condenses and then turns into rain. And by the time you get over these mountains, there's very little moisture left in the air, and it's a much drier place. If you've ever been to Washington State, you might be aware Seattle is very, very wet, and then the eastern part of the state is quite dry. That's a little bit more drastic difference than when we're talking about Alsace, but it is essentially the same idea. And that is from the Vosges Mountains to the west of the region. And with those mountains, the vineyards are planted in the hillsides and the plains. And just one little side note, it's not something necessary to try to memorize right now at the beginning of your education, but as we continue on in this, especially in the next level of courses that I will be making for you guys, we'll talk about all these distinct soil types that Alsace has. And they are very proud of this. They have 13 different soil types that they have named. And those are from all of those mountain hillsides to the plains. And just note there's 13, just in case you get into some conversation with any guests and they start talking about it. It's something they're really proud of, but you do not have to memorize it right now, so don't freak out about it. I know it's a lot of information. And the main grapes, we have Riesling, Pinot Gris, Muscat, Gewürztraminer, and Pinot Noir. And the noble varieties of those would be the Pinot Gris, Riesling, Muscat, and Gewürztraminer. We also have Sylvaner, Chardonnay, Auxerrois, Chasselas, and Sauvignon Rosé. And little side note, the Chardonnay is specifically only permitted for the sparkling wines of Alsace. So you're not going to see a bottle here that says Chardonnay with still wine. You're not going to see that. And the wines produced, they do red, white, and rosé, sparkling, white, and rosé as well. And we already went over the Vosges Mountains. The river that flows through there is the Rhine River, spelled R-H-I-N-E. And then as it continues on into Germany, that's the same one that's spelled R-H-E-I-N. We have two different subregions. So when you look at Alsace, you can break it up. Here you can take a look at the map into two different main regions, the Basse-Rhône and the Haute-Rhône. And if you speak French, I understand this can sound a little bit confusing because Basse means lower and Haute means upper. But the lower is north and the upper is south. So try to think of it in terms of elevation more than north and south, because the elevation is higher in the southern portion for the most part. And then when you take a look at that pie chart, just for some visualization of what is produced the most, about 70% of all the production in Alsace is under the regular Alsace appellation. 23% Cremant, so that's the sparkling, and then only about 6% of that left over is the Grand Cru, which is what they're very well known for. They're amazing wines, honestly, and you can get some for a pretty good price point. I have brought some in to do on pairing menus, and it is, I'm telling you, one of the most fun conversations that you can have with guests. So now onto the wine labels. I do have a bottle here that we can go over just to show you. You already saw that it does have the grape variety labeled on here, which looks a little confusing compared to the rest of France because this is the only region that actually does that. And so that's what we would call a varietal wine. It's 100% of the stated variety. And there are exceptions to that. We do have some like Pinot Blanc can be Pinot Blanc or Auxerrois. And then one that's called Pinot or Klevner can be Pinot Blanc, Auxerrois, or Pinot Noir, as long as the Pinot Noir is vinified as a white wine. Because remember, Pinot Noir has the dark skin but light juice. And then Vendange Tardive. What is this? This is a late harvest wine. There's two different ones, the VT and SGN. VT is always late harvest. It may or may not be botrytis. And if you remember, botrytis is a type of bunched rot, and it kind of attacks the grapes. But in the perfect conditions, typically where there's some more humidity, and remember we have the Rhine River there, it produces these finished wines that are like really rich and honeyed and gingered and just beautiful. And so the VT may or may not be, and the SGN is another late harvest wine that is always botrytis. And again, at this level, it's not necessary to know these specific details of it, but I hope it helps to get you to understand it a bit more. So every grape variety, first of all, both of these can only be made from those noble varieties, Gewürztraminer, Pinot Gris, Muscat, and Riesling. And each grape variety has a different minimum must weight, and that's one way of measuring the sugar content of the grapes at harvest. And with the SGN overall, each of those grape varieties has a higher minimum must weight than the VT. So there's more overall sugar concentration in the grapes, legally speaking. VT can be higher if they want to, but from the legal standpoint, they have to be a higher minimum must weight for each variety than, respectively, those of VT. And then Cremant d'Alsace, this is your sparkling wine from Alsace, and they can be white or rosé. And just a little note, when you are writing a wine list and you have an Alsace Gewürztraminer, just make sure you note that they do not put an umlaut over the U. They do in other places, not in Alsace, so it's not a typo if you see it. And just so you know, when you are creating those lists or talking about writing anything, if it's Gewürztraminer from Alsace, no umlaut. So now moving into the appellations themselves. The Alsace appellation, these are still white, rosé, and red wines. The rosé and red are made from Pinot Noir only. And the wines have to be made in this traditional bottle, and it's called a Vendarin or Flûte d'Alsace bottle. It does look somewhat similar to some of these bottles you see of like German Riesling. You can see side by side here. They look pretty similar. There are a little bit of some differences. One to note is, see on the bottom of this one from Alsace, it still has a punt, and this one does not. And this one is also thinner than this one here. But that is the traditional bottle that it has to be bottled in. The VT and SGN wines, these are more like a subcategory of the Alsace appellation, so it's a label that can be added to it. So it's not its own appellation. It would be an Alsace AOP that is then either the dry table wine or the late harvest, either VT or SGN. There is an exception here of the varietal labeling, and that is these wines that are labeled Edelsviker. And it's kind of an interesting thing. I'll just say, don't knock it till you try it, because there are a lot of wine professionals that I personally know who go, oh, that stuff is so bad, it's just crappy wine, blah, blah, blah. Not necessarily. So these wines are made from really any permitted variety except for Sauvignon Rosé and Chardonnay, and they don't necessarily have to be vintage dated, and it can be a single variety, it can be a blend. I love this because I think it just gives producers a little bit more wiggle room to play with certain things. And that's something that's really important when we talk about things like climate change, because the land is changing, but the laws aren't. So having that little bit of space to play around is really important to be able to see, hey, what might be better in 10, 15, 20, 30 years as these things are going on. And you know what? This is what I always tell people. Super Tuscan, something that's really well known and so many people love, wasn't a thing for a long time. It was some winemakers who were playing around with things and not producing it necessarily as like the most specific thing that they could with where their vineyards and wineries were. They expanded it to a very generic designation in Italy to produce what's now known as Super Tuscan. So these things are important. So I will say, just don't hate on it immediately. Yes, there's so many people who say, oh, it's just cheap, crappy wine from Alsace, blah, 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 don't drink it. Just try it. There could be some really cool projects going on, so just try to not hate on it immediately. Then the sparkling wines, this, as I mentioned earlier, is the only one that allows the addition of Chardonnay. And these are made with the traditional method, which is the champagne method, and méthode traditionnelle, méthode champenoise. There's a lot of different names for it. But essentially what it is we do an initial fermentation to make the base wine, and then it's bottled before that secondary fermentation. So the secondary fermentation is occurring in the bottle, that's capped, and that's how we get the bubbles in the wine. And the sweetness designations mirror that of champagne exactly, so we have the dry all the way to the sweet. And again, the wines can be made either white or rosé, and the rosé is produced either by maceration or saignée, and remember saignée is that bleeding method. And then the Grand Crus. So this one I know can be a little confusing, so I just want to lay it out here and say pretty clearly, there is no one Alsace Grand Cru appellation. So each one has its own. It's not like Alsace Grand Cru and then, oh, we're going to name the vineyard on here. This is the vineyard that is a Grand Cru vineyard site. That's the appellation. And these wines, for the most part, are made only from the noble varieties, the Riesling, Muscat, Pinot Gris, and Gewürztraminer. Though there is one exception to that, and that is in Zotzenberg, they can use Sylvaner. And you don't need to know that right now. It is something that we'll get into more in the next level of studying, but I just wanted to point that out to you. And also, a little side note that is important for you to know is Grand Cru can also produce those late harvest wines. So you might see a VT or SGN that is a Grand Cru labeled wine. Then when we talk about the winemaking, some things are very different, just differing from producer to producer and vintage to vintage. But one thing overall, just to note, is there's not really use of new oak. There's a lot of used oak in Alsace, and that's going to affect things stylistically. And just so you remember, oak is permeable. There is oxygen that can get in. And if you remember from the vinification and viticulture video, we talked about how oxygen can affect texture overall of wine. So that's what we're getting from that use, and not necessarily flavors and aromas coming through from the oak. So what about the sustainability, organic, biodynamic production? Alsace does a lot of this, but not all of it is necessarily going to be certified. And that could be just from producers going, oh, well, this is how I've always done it. I don't really care about certifications. Or they know that the certifications are really expensive, so they don't do it. But there are some things that they are working on, and they have some goals to continue to be more and more environmentally friendly. And some of them are part of a group that are trying to get to zero chemical fertilizers used, zero synthetic pesticides. These vineyards that are a part of this project are subject to regular inspections. They are working to minimize the use of sulfur in the winemaking process. And if you remember, sulfur is used kind of like a shelf stabilizer. So just as an example, like I live and work in Chicago. These wines are from a country in a different continent. And by the time it gets here, that's a lot of movement. And the wines aren't the most stable. So that's where sulfur can come into use and be really helpful, but not always necessary. There are certain practices that we can put in place, but sometimes the no sulfur added might just make things a little bit more difficult for you. And about 15% of Alsace's vineyard area is currently certified organic or biodynamic. And as I said earlier, that doesn't count all of the ones who are already doing that. And just one of the most important things for you to know when we're talking about the sustainability here and the way that they are doing these winemaking practices is in Alsace, the weather conditions can really vary quite a bit from year to year. So when they're doing biodynamic winemaking, remember that's more like hands-off kind of winemaking. They're not controlling much. So when there's fermentation, they're not controlling a lot of it. So when there's warmer vintages, it may go through full malolactic fermentation, whereas when it's colder, it may not. So that's where things are going to differ, and you're not going to have exactly the same wine every single year, which is honestly more fun and more in line with the kind of idea of terroir with wine. And don't worry about it of trying to sit down and go memorize every single vintage and all the conditions with all the... You don't have to do that. This comes with time of working in the industry, tasting with producers, tasting with importers, working with the wines over and over. You will start to learn these things, and you don't have to just sit down and try to go, oh my goodness, the last 15 years in all these places, I have to know all these vintage conditions. You really don't. There are other ways that will make it much easier to start to learn about these things. So just to recap, really the most important things to know here is Alsace, the location in eastern France. It is continental, but a little bit drier because of that rain shadow from the Vosges Mountains, and those vineyards are in those hillsides and plains. The noble varieties are Riesling, Muscat, Gewürztraminer, and Pinot Gris. Most of the wines have the variety labeled on the bottle, and that's called a varietal wine. The two dessert wines, VT and SGN, can be produced under the regular Alsace appellation or the Grand Crus. All of the Grand Crus have their own appellation, and instead of having just one generic Alsace Grand Cru appellation, the sparkling wines are made in the same method as champagne. And the still wines of Alsace are going to be drier. Some of them tend to have a little bit more texture to them overall. And again, that's something that varies from year to year, especially with that biodynamic production and potential of going through malolactic fermentation or not. That's going to affect it a lot. And they really are some wonderful producers who are doing a lot of work in the environmental side of the industry. And yeah, Alsace is very fun. The appellation was officially legalized in 1962, so it is fairly new. But remember that Alsace has only officially been back as part of France since 1945. And there's the whole mix of culture of like French and German everything, and it is a wonderful place. The wines are very fun to play around with, great for pairings. Hope you learned something, have some fun. Please let me know if you have any questions on here, and I'll see you in the next video.